for young people in the 21st century, it's almost impossible to imagine an America of the mid-20th century that was largely defined by rigid racial segregation called Jim Crow. But it was the America I grew up in. What life was like in the 1950s in the South for Negroes, as we called ourselves then, is that black people in small towns, frequently at stores, at dry goods stores, before we had Walmarts, weren't allowed to try on caps or a pair of pants or gloves. We couldn't try on articles of clothing to purchase because whites refused us permission to do that. We couldn't go into restaurants or public toilets or restrooms. When I was a child traveling across the South with my parents, we didn't know what gas stations we could stop at to use the public facilities because Negroes might not be allowed to use the toilets. We stopped at restaurants, never quite knowing whether we would even be allowed to purchase food. In the 1950s, blacks in many churches were not allowed to worship with whites, even if they were of the same denomination. In some places, they had nigger pews or nigger heavens on the second floor where a handful of blacks could worship. Blacks uniformly weren't buried in the same churchyards as whites. They were buried in separate segregated yards. Blacks weren't permitted to attend white schools. Blacks, until very recently in the Deep South, in the 1940s and 50s, in many places weren't even allowed to testify in courts against whites. Certainly blacks accused of crimes until Supreme Court cases emerged in the 30s were not even allowed to have access to fair juries where blacks who might live in that community would be represented on the jury. So Jim Crow segregation was a whole series of irrational, humiliating, and cruel barriers that denied the humanity of black people. And this regime, this intolerable system of oppression existed for the better part of a century. Now, for African Americans who lived under this system, the practical question was, how do you navigate it? How do you get by day to day without either losing your mind or your soul? It was a practical struggle. Many African Americans simply fled the Jim Crow South to live in the North, where racial segregation was much less, but there was racial discrimination. And Jim Crow had the weight of law in the South, but in the North there was a discrimination called de facto segregation, without the sanction of law, but nevertheless still segmented blacks and whites into parallel racial universes where we spoke the same language, were theoretically governed by the same sets of laws, but encountered reality in fundamentally different ways.